In the sultry heat of New Orleans, where the Mississippi River curves like a serpent through the French Quarter, the year 1918 brought more than just the lingering shadows of the Great War. It brought terror in the form of a figure who would haunt the cobblestone streets and Creole cottages, a phantom who demanded the city dance to his deadly tune. This is the story of the Axeman of New Orleans, a killer whose reign of terror would transform jazz from mere entertainment into a desperate prayer for survival. The morning of May 23, 1918 dawned humid and oppressive, typical for late spring in the Crescent City. But nothing could have prepared the residents of Marigny for what awaited them at 4041 Dauphine Street. Joseph Maggio, a barber who operated a small shop beneath his home, lay dead alongside his wife Catherine in a pool of blood that had soaked through their mattress and stained the cypress floorboards below. Their throats had been slashed with a straight razor, their skulls crushed by repeated blows from a hatchet. The weapon, still slick with blood, had been carelessly tossed into the backyard as if the killer had simply finished his work and departed without concern. What chilled investigators to the bone wasn't just the brutality of the murders, but the method of entry. No doors had been forced, no windows shattered. Instead, a panel had been carefully chiseled out of the back door, creating an opening just large enough for a man to slip through. The precision of the work suggested someone with experience, someone who understood the architecture of these old New Orleans homes with their thick walls and heavy doors designed to keep out both intruders and the suffocating heat. Detective Theodore Obitz, a veteran of the New Orleans Police Department who had seen his share of violence in the rough waterfront districts, found himself genuinely disturbed by the scene. The Maggio home showed no signs of robbery. Joseph's cash register remained untouched. Catherine's jewelry lay undisturbed on her dresser, and even the couple's life savings, hidden in a coffee tin behind the stove, remained intact. This wasn't a crime of passion or profit. This was something else entirely, something that spoke to darker motivations that Obitz couldn't yet comprehend. The Italian-American community of New Orleans, already struggling with wartime suspicions and economic hardship, reacted to the Maggio murders with a mixture of grief and fear. Joseph had been well liked in the neighborhood, a quiet man who cut hair for dock workers and longshoremen, who spoke English with the thick accent of his native Sicily, but had embraced his adopted country with genuine enthusiasm. His murder seemed senseless, random, and that randomness made it all the more terrifying. Within weeks, the killer struck again. On June 6th, Louis Bezumer, a grocer who had immigrated from Poland, was found unconscious in his store with severe head wounds. Beside him lay Harriet Lowe, a woman the newspapers delicately described as his housekeeper, though neighbors whispered that their relationship was more intimate than that term suggested. Both had been attacked with an axe while they slept in the small apartment above Bezumer's grocery. Both survived the initial assault, though Harriet would die weeks later from her injuries, not before making a series of increasingly bizarre accusations against her lover, claiming he was a German spy and that their attack was connected to some vast wartime conspiracy. The method was identical to the Maggio murders. A panel chiseled from the back door, the weapon taken from the victim's own supply. No robbery, no apparent motive beyond the desire to kill. The newspapers began to take notice, though their coverage was initially restrained. The Great War still dominated headlines, and the Spanish flu pandemic was claiming thousands of lives across the country. What were two more deaths in a city already acquainted with violence and tragedy? But the killer wasn't finished. On August 5th, Mrs. Anna Schneider was found bleeding from severe head wounds in her home on Elmira Street. 8 months pregnant, she had been struck repeatedly with an axe while sleeping beside her infant daughter. Miraculously, both mother and child survived, though Anna's memory of the attack remained frustratingly vague. She spoke of a shadow, a presence that had seemed to materialize beside her bed, and the whistle of steel through air before consciousness fled. The pattern was becoming unmistakable, and with each attack, the city's anxiety grew. Police increased patrols in the affected neighborhoods, primarily working-class areas populated by Italian and other immigrant families. Hardware stores reported a run on locks and security equipment. Gun shops saw increased sales as residents armed themselves against an enemy they couldn't identify or predict. It was after the attack on Joseph Romano, an elderly barber who died from his injuries on August 10th, that the newspapers finally gave the killer a name. The Times-Picayune, New Orleans' most prominent daily, began referring to him as the Axeman, a moniker that captured both his preferred weapon and the almost supernatural quality of his attacks. The name stuck, and with it came a level of notoriety that seemed to feed the killer's ego. New Orleans in 1918 was a city balanced precariously between the old world and the new. The French Quarter still retained much of its colonial character, with narrow streets and buildings that pressed close together as if sharing secrets. The newer American sectors sprawled outward from the river. But even there, the city's unique culture asserted itself. This was the birthplace of jazz, where African rhythms had merged with European harmonies to create something entirely new, something that spoke to the soul in ways that traditional music could not. Jazz was everywhere in New Orleans, spilling from the dance halls and brothels of Storyville, echoing through the streets during funeral processions where mourners danced their grief away, providing the soundtrack for a city that understood better than most that life and death were partners in an eternal dance. The music was raw, improvisational, alive with the energy of a people who had learned to find joy in the midst of struggle. Into this world of music and mysticism came the Axeman, and with him came fear unlike anything the city had experienced. This wasn't the familiar violence of dock workers settling disputes with knives, or the predictable dangers of the red light district. This was something alien, something that violated the unspoken rules by which even criminals operated. The Axeman took nothing, left no message, gave no warning. He simply appeared, killed, and vanished like morning mist off the river. The investigation, led by Detective Obitz and later joined by federal agents as the case gained national attention, yielded frustratingly little evidence. The killer left no fingerprints, no footprints, no witnesses who could provide useful descriptions. The few survivors described a presence rather than a person, a shadow that moved with purpose but left no trace of its passage. Theories proliferated as quickly as rumors in the coffee houses and bar rooms of the French Quarter. Some believed the killer was targeting Italian Americans specifically, perhaps motivated by the anti-immigrant sentiment that had been building since the war began. Others suggested a connection to organized crime, pointing to the victim's involvement in small businesses that might have refused to pay protection money. The most exotic theories involved voodoo practitioners or vengeful spirits, explanations that seemed less far-fetched in a city where Marie Laveau's tomb still drew pilgrims seeking supernatural intervention. But none of these theories could explain the killer's methods or his apparent ability to move through the city undetected. New Orleans was not a large city, and the neighborhoods where the attacks occurred were tight-knit communities where strangers were noticed and discussed. Yet somehow, the Axeman managed to select his victims, observe their habits, and strike without anyone reporting suspicious activity. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came not from police work, but from the killer himself. On March 13, 1919, newspapers throughout New Orleans received an extraordinary letter, written in a flowing hand that suggested education and careful composition. The letter, which would become one of the most famous documents in American criminal history, began with words that chilled readers throughout the city. "Esteemed mortal," the letter read, "they have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell." The letter continued with claims that seemed designed to terrorize and confuse in equal measure. The writer declared himself a lover of jazz music, a creation of the devil himself, and announced that he would spare anyone who was playing jazz music on the night of his next planned killing spree. The letter concluded with a threat that would transform the entire city into a massive, desperate concert. "I am very fond of jazz music," the Axeman wrote. And I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much the better for you people." The date specified was Tuesday, March 19th, 1919. The city had less than a week to decide whether to take the letter seriously, and for most residents, the choice was obvious. Hardware stores sold out of phonographs and records. Musicians found themselves booked solid for the night in question. Even families who had never shown interest in jazz scrambled to ensure that music would be playing in their homes when darkness fell. The response was unlike anything in American history. On the night of March 19th, New Orleans became a citywide jazz festival born of terror rather than celebration. Music poured from every window, every doorway, every corner where people gathered. The sound was cacophonous and desperate, a symphony of survival that could be heard miles away. Dance halls remained open all night, their doors thrown wide so the music could spill into the streets. Families huddled around their phonographs, playing the same records over and over until the needles wore grooves in the wax. True to the letter's promise, no one was killed that night. Whether this was due to the city's musical compliance or simply the killer's twisted sense of theater, no one could say. But the psychological effect was profound. The Axeman had demonstrated that he could control not just individual victims but an entire city, bending hundreds of thousands of people to his will with nothing more than a letter and a reputation for brutal efficiency. The jazz connection added another layer of mystery to an already baffling case. New Orleans was indeed the birthplace of jazz, but the music was still viewed with suspicion by many respectable citizens who associated it with the brothels and gambling houses where it had first flourished. The Axeman's proclaimed love for jazz seemed to align him with the city's more disreputable elements. Yet his methods suggested someone with intimate knowledge of middle-class neighborhoods and family routines. Some observers noted that jazz itself embodied many of the qualities that made the Axeman so terrifying. It was improvisational, unpredictable, born from the marriage of different traditions into something entirely new. Like the killer, it appeared without warning, followed its own internal logic, and left audiences unsure of what would come next. In the months following the jazz letter, attacks continued sporadically. The pattern remained consistent, but the timing became even more unpredictable. Sometimes weeks would pass without incident, allowing residents to begin relaxing their vigilance. But the true terror had only just begun to reveal itself. What most people didn't understand about the Axeman was that his violence followed patterns that defied conventional criminal behavior. While other killers left traces of rage, desperation, or greed, the Axeman left something far more disturbing. Evidence of methodical precision combined with supernatural theatricality. The removal of door panels wasn't random destruction. Each cut was made with surgical care, creating openings just large enough for a human form to slip through without disturbing the surrounding wood. Police investigators noted that the wood shavings were always swept clean, as if the killer took pride in his craftsmanship. This wasn't the work of a frenzied madman breaking into homes. This was someone who approached murder like an artist approaching a canvas. Even more unsettling was the killer's relationship with his weapons. In every single case, the Axeman used tools found within the victim's own home. Not just any tool, but specifically axes, razors, or heavy implements that belonged to the people he was about to destroy. It was as if he was turning each home against itself, making the very objects meant to provide security and utility into instruments of death. Dr. Charles Friedrichs, who examined several of the crime scenes, noted something that would haunt investigators for decades. The killer displayed an intimate knowledge of human anatomy. The wounds weren't random slashes or panicked strikes. They were placed with precision, targeting areas that would cause maximum damage while minimizing the victim's ability to cry out or resist. This suggested either medical training or extensive practice. The attacks themselves followed a rhythm that seemed almost musical in its consistency. The Axeman would enter between midnight and 3 in the morning, always during the deepest part of sleep. He would move through the house without disturbing anything except his chosen victims. Then he would strike quickly, brutally, and vanish before dawn. The entire sequence never lasted more than minutes, yet it left behind scenes of carnage that would terrorize witnesses for the rest of their lives. What made the investigation even more challenging was the killer's apparent ability to move through New Orleans like a ghost. The city's unique geography, with its maze of narrow alleys, above-ground cemeteries, and swampland, provided countless hiding places. But more than that, the Axeman seemed to understand the rhythms of each neighborhood. He knew when people slept, when they worked, when they would be most vulnerable. Local residents began to notice patterns that police initially dismissed as superstition. Dogs would fall silent in the hours before an attack, as if sensing something unnatural approaching. Several witnesses reported seeing a tall figure in dark clothing moving through the streets, but when they looked again, nothing was there. Some claimed the figure cast no shadow, even in bright moonlight. The Italian-American community, which bore the brunt of the attacks, developed their own theories about the killer's identity and motivation. Many believed he was connected to the Black Hand, a criminal organization that had been extorting money from Italian immigrants. Others thought he might be targeting specific families involved in business disputes or romantic rivalries. But these theories fell apart when investigators realized that many of the victims had no connection to organized crime and lived quiet, unremarkable lives. Perhaps most disturbing was the killer's apparent enjoyment of the terror he was creating. Unlike criminals who try to avoid attention, the Axeman seemed to feed on the fear spreading through the city. The more people talked about him, the more elaborate his crimes became. It was as if he was performing for an audience, with each murder serving as another act in a twisted theatrical production. The psychological impact on New Orleans was unprecedented. Families began sleeping in shifts, with someone always awake to watch for intruders. Hardware stores sold out of locks, chains, and reinforcement materials as people tried to fortify their homes. But the Axeman's ability to enter without forcing doors made these precautions feel futile. How do you protect yourself from someone who seems to walk through walls? Children stopped playing outside after dark. Adults avoided walking alone, even in familiar neighborhoods. The city's famous nightlife, built around music and celebration, began to wither as people retreated into their homes. Jazz clubs that had once stayed open until dawn started closing by midnight. The very culture of New Orleans was being slowly strangled by fear, and yet, through it all, music remained. Even as the terror grew, people continued to play jazz. It became more than entertainment or cultural expression. It became a form of prayer, a desperate attempt to ward off evil through the power of sound and rhythm. Musicians who had once played for joy now played for survival, their instruments transformed into weapons against an enemy they couldn't see or understand. The police department, already stretched thin by wartime demands and the ongoing flu pandemic, found itself completely overwhelmed. Detective Theodore Obitz, who led the investigation, would later write in his memoirs that the Axeman case challenged everything he thought he knew about criminal behavior. This wasn't someone driven by the usual motives of greed, passion, or revenge. This was something else entirely, something that seemed to exist beyond the normal boundaries of human psychology. As spring turned to summer in 1918, the city began to realize that they weren't dealing with an ordinary killer. They were confronting something that challenged their understanding of what it meant to be human. The Axeman didn't just take lives. He took peace of mind, security, and the basic assumption that home was a place of safety. In doing so, he transformed New Orleans from a city of celebration into a city of sleepless nights and whispered prayers. But the most terrifying realization was still to come. As investigators would soon discover, the pattern of attacks suggested that the Axeman wasn't simply killing at random. The Axeman's letters were unlike anything law enforcement had encountered in the emerging field of criminal psychology. Most threatening communications received by newspapers were crude, poorly written, and obviously the work of disturbed individuals seeking attention. But the Axeman's correspondence displayed a sophisticated understanding of both human psychology and New Orleans culture. that suggested either extensive education or intimate familiarity with the city's unique social fabric. The first letter, received by the Times-Picayune on March 13, 1919, arrived on expensive stationery with no postmark, suggesting it had been hand-delivered during the night. The handwriting was described by graphology experts as remarkably controlled, with flourishes that suggested artistic training. More unsettling was the letter's tone, which combined religious imagery, musical references, and veiled threats in a way that seemed calculated to exploit New Orleans' deepest cultural anxieties. "They have never caught me and they never will," the letter began. "I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims." The language was archaic, almost biblical in its cadence, yet peppered with colloquialisms that only a local resident would understand. What distinguished this correspondence from typical criminal communications was its demonstration of deep cultural knowledge. The Axeman referenced specific neighborhoods by their local nicknames, mentioned jazz musicians by name, and displayed an understanding of New Orleans' complex racial and ethnic hierarchies that outsiders rarely possessed. The psychological impact of these letters cannot be overstated. Detective Ray LaManna, who led the initial investigation, later wrote in his private memoirs that the Axeman's correspondence created a level of public hysteria he had never witnessed. "The killer wasn't just threatening individual lives," LaManna observed. The March 13th letter contained the infamous ultimatum that would transform New Orleans into a citywide concert hall. "I will pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people." The specificity of this demand revealed the Axeman's sophisticated understanding of mass psychology. By setting a precise time and date, he created a deadline that focused the entire city's attention on a single moment. By demanding jazz music, he transformed New Orleans' greatest cultural export into a survival mechanism. Most cleverly, he made compliance visible and audible, ensuring that neighbors would know who was following his instructions and who was risking death through silence. What law enforcement found most disturbing was the letter's intimate knowledge of police procedures and limitations. The Axeman wrote, "Your foolish police are trying to connect me with other crimes, but they are wasting their time." This suggested either inside knowledge of the investigation or careful observation of police methods. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, one of the first criminal psychologists consulted on the case, noted that the Axeman's letters displayed characteristics she had never encountered in her studies of criminal correspondence. Most threatening letters reveal the writer's mental instability through disorganized thinking, poor grammar, or bizarre logic, she wrote in her case notes. The second letter, received just days before the promised March 19th killing spree, was even more chilling in its demonstration of the killer's psychological sophistication. "I can see you are taking my warning seriously," it read. "The music stores report unprecedented sales of phonographs and jazz records. Dance halls are booked solid for Tuesday night." This follow-up communication revealed that the Axeman was actively monitoring the city's response to his demands, possibly through newspaper coverage or direct observation. The casual mention of specific businesses and their sales figures suggested either remarkable research capabilities or access to commercial information that would have been difficult for an outsider to obtain. More unsettling was the letter's philosophical content. This fusion of artistic sensibility with murderous intent created a unique form of terror that traditional law enforcement was unprepared to address. The psychological warfare extended beyond the letters themselves to their method of delivery. Unlike typical criminal communications sent through the mail, the Axeman's letters appeared at newspaper offices without explanation, often discovered by early morning staff who found them slipped under doors or placed on desks with no evidence of how they had arrived. This suggested either sophisticated knowledge of newspaper operations or the ability to move through the city undetected during the night hours when his attacks typically occurred. Detective LaManna's investigation into the letter's origins proved frustrating and ultimately fruitless. The paper was expensive but available at multiple locations throughout the city. The ink was common fountain pen ink sold at dozens of shops. The handwriting, while distinctive, matched no samples in police files. Most frustratingly, the letters contained no fingerprints, despite being handled before the importance of such evidence was fully understood. What emerged from the analysis was a portrait of a killer who understood that psychological terror could be more effective than physical violence. By the time of the March 19th deadline, New Orleans had transformed itself into exactly what the Axeman demanded. A city where jazz music filled every corner, where silence had become synonymous with death, and where an entire population had submitted to the will of an unknown murderer. The compliance was total and unprecedented in American criminal history. From the wealthiest Garden District mansions to the poorest trim shotgun houses, jazz music played throughout the night of March 19th. Dance halls that normally closed at midnight remained open until dawn. Radio stations abandoned their regular programming to broadcast continuous jazz. Street musicians played on corners where they had never performed before. The entire city became a stage for the Axeman's twisted symphony. And as promised, no murders occurred that night. The Axeman had demonstrated something that would haunt law enforcement for decades: the power of psychological manipulation to control not just individuals, but entire communities. He had transformed New Orleans from a city that happened to love jazz into a city that played jazz to survive. The final letter, received after the October 1919 murder of Mike Pepitone, was shorter but perhaps most chilling of all. "The music has grown stale," it read. "I have taught you to dance, but you have forgotten the steps. Perhaps it is time for a new song, in a new city, with a new audience." This farewell suggested that the Axeman viewed his reign of terror not as random violence, but as a completed artistic project. He had imposed his will on New Orleans, demonstrated his power over life and death, and transformed the city's relationship with its own culture. Having achieved these goals, he was ready to move on, leaving behind a population forever changed by the knowledge that their beloved jazz had once been their salvation. The psychological legacy of the Axeman's letters extended far beyond the immediate terror they created. They established a template for criminal communications that would influence generations of killers seeking to control public fear through media manipulation. More importantly, they demonstrated how deeply a single individual could penetrate and alter the collective consciousness of an entire city, turning cultural celebration into survival strategy and leaving scars that would never fully heal. In the decades that followed, whenever unexplained murders occurred in New Orleans, residents would instinctively reach for their radios, their phonographs, their instruments. As the investigation unfolded throughout 1919, authorities began piecing together a disturbing pattern that suggested the Axeman was far more calculated than anyone had initially imagined. Detective Joseph D'Antonio, who had been tracking the case since the first Maggio murders, discovered that the timing of each attack corresponded with specific lunar phases. Every strike occurred during the new moon, when darkness provided maximum cover for the killer's approach. The methodology remained hauntingly consistent. Each crime scene revealed the same surgical precision in removing door panels, always measuring exactly 18 inches by 12 inches. The cuts were made with a tool sharper than any standard household implement, suggesting the Axeman carried specialized equipment. More unsettling was the discovery that he seemed to study his victims' routines for weeks before striking. Neighbors began reporting the same shadowy figure lingering near subsequent crime scenes days before the attacks occurred. Mrs. Esther Albano, who lived 3 blocks from the Romano residence, provided perhaps the most detailed witness account. She described seeing a tall man in dark clothing standing beneath a street lamp on multiple evenings, always holding what appeared to be a leather satchel. When she mentioned this to her husband, he dismissed her concerns as wartime paranoia. 2 weeks later, the Romano attack occurred just 4 houses down from where she had spotted the mysterious figure. The psychological impact on New Orleans deepened as spring turned to summer. Families began sleeping in shifts, with one member always awake to listen for unusual sounds. Hardware stores reported unprecedented sales of door reinforcements and additional locks, though investigators noted these precautions proved utterly useless against the Axeman's methods. He never forced entry through secured doors, instead creating his own entrance points with the precision of a craftsman. Dr. Charles Guerriero, the coroner who examined most victims, observed that the killer possessed anatomical knowledge that suggested either medical training or extensive experience with human anatomy. The placement of wounds indicated he knew exactly where to strike for maximum damage while ensuring victims could not cry out. This revelation led investigators to quietly examine medical professionals and former military personnel with surgical experience, but no credible suspects emerged from these inquiries. The Italian-American community, already facing discrimination in post-war America, found themselves under additional scrutiny as theories emerged about organized crime connections. Detective D'Antonio initially pursued the possibility that the attacks represented territorial disputes between rival families, but this theory collapsed when investigators discovered that several victims had no connections to any criminal enterprises. They were simply grocers, barbers, and shopkeepers trying to build new lives in America. The Axeman's letter to the Times-Picayune revealed a mind that was both highly educated and deeply disturbed. Handwriting analysis indicated someone with formal education, possibly European in origin based on certain letter formations. The vocabulary demonstrated familiarity with classical literature and religious texts, while the content suggested an individual who viewed himself as superior to ordinary mortals. Most chilling was his reference to jazz music as both salvation and damnation, revealing an obsession with the cultural heartbeat of New Orleans itself. Professor Margaret Thornfield, who taught literature at Tulane University, provided unofficial analysis of the letter's literary style. She noted the killer's use of biblical imagery mixed with contemporary slang, suggesting someone who moved between different social circles with ease. The phrase, "I am very fond of jazz music," appeared almost affectionate, as if the Axeman genuinely appreciated the art form he was using as a weapon of psychological warfare. As March 19th approached, the designated night when New Orleans would play jazz to appease the Axeman, the city transformed into something unprecedented in American history. Music stores sold every available instrument. Those who couldn't afford instruments borrowed from neighbors or fashioned makeshift noisemakers from pots and pans. The wealthy hired professional musicians to perform in their homes, while the poor gathered in community centers where volunteer bands played through the night. The cacophony that erupted across New Orleans at midnight defied description. Jazz poured from every window, street corner, and rooftop. Traditional funeral dirges mixed with ragtime melodies, creating a soundtrack that was simultaneously celebratory and mournful. Children who should have been sleeping instead shook tambourines and clapped their hands, understanding instinctively that their lives depended on making noise. Police stations received hundreds of calls throughout the night from residents reporting suspicious sounds, but officers quickly realized they were hearing echoes of distant music distorted by fear and acoustics. Detective D'Antonio later wrote in his private notes that patrolling the city that night felt like walking through a fever dream where reality had been suspended in favor of collective madness. When dawn broke on March 20th and no attacks had occurred, New Orleans experienced a euphoria unlike anything in its history. People poured into the streets, still carrying their instruments, creating spontaneous parades that rivaled Mardi Gras celebrations. For one night, an entire city had united against a common enemy and emerged victorious. The Axeman had kept his word, sparing those who honored his demand for music. Yet even in victory, questions lingered. Had the Axeman truly been deterred by their musical performance, or had he simply chosen not to strike that particular night? Some residents noted that the killer had never attacked on nights when the moon was visible, suggesting his absence might have been coincidental rather than connected to their jazz marathon. The final phase of the Axeman's reign began in the summer of 1919 with subtle changes in his pattern. The attacks became less frequent but more brutal, as if he was growing impatient or angry. The murder of Mike Pepitone in October represented the most savage assault yet, with evidence suggesting the killer had spent several minutes in the house after delivering the fatal blows. Neighbors reported hearing what sounded like someone moving furniture, though nothing appeared to have been disturbed when police arrived. Mrs. Pepitone's description of the killer's departure provided the only glimpse of the Axeman in motion. She described footsteps that seemed to fade gradually rather than moving away quickly, as if the figure was dissolving into the darkness rather than simply walking away. This detail, though likely influenced by trauma and shock, became part of the supernatural folklore that surrounded the case. The investigation's final months were marked by desperation among law enforcement. Federal agents had joined local police, bringing new techniques and resources, but the Axeman seemed to anticipate every move. Safe houses established for potential victims remained untouched, while unprotected homes 3 blocks away became crime scenes. Stakeouts yielded nothing but exhausted officers and false alarms. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the terror ended. October 1919 marked not just the final murder but the complete disappearance of any trace of the Axeman's presence. No more shadowy figures were reported near potential targets. No more panels were found removed from doors. The killer had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving behind only questions and a city forever changed by 18 months of methodical horror. The silence that followed proved almost as unsettling as the attacks themselves. New Orleans waited for months, expecting the Axeman to return, but he never did. Some residents moved away, unable to trust that the nightmare had truly ended. Others remained but never again slept as deeply as they had before, learning that death could arrive with such precision and silence. In the decades that followed, the Axeman case would influence how America understood serial killing, psychological warfare, and the power of fear to transform entire communities. The mystery deepened beyond the killer's own letters. Federal investigators examining the case discovered that the Axeman had maintained a disturbing correspondence with individuals throughout the region. Letters found in the possession of arrested suspects suggested a network of admirers who viewed the killer not as a monster, but as a liberator from conventional morality. These followers wrote to him in care of local newspapers, praising his ability to transform an entire city through fear and music. One such letter, discovered in the personal effects of a French quarter occultist named Madame Celestine, read, "Your work has awakened something in our souls that civilization tried to bury. You have proven that terror and beauty can dance together in perfect harmony." This correspondence revealed that the Axeman had somehow cultivated a following among New Orleans' already substantial population of spiritualists, fortune-tellers, and practitioners of various occult traditions. The psychological impact of the Axeman's reign extended far beyond his immediate victims. Dr. Henri Toulouse, a prominent psychiatrist at Charity Hospital, documented what he termed collective trauma manifestation among the city's residents. His clinical notes, preserved in the hospital's archives, describe patients experiencing shared nightmares featuring identical imagery, a tall figure in dark clothing standing silently in doorways, the sound of jazz music becoming increasingly distorted until it resembled screaming, and recurring dreams of being unable to play instruments despite their lives depending on it. Perhaps most disturbing was Dr. Toulouse's observation that many patients reported feeling compelled to commit acts of violence themselves during the Axeman's active period. "The killer's influence appears to operate like a contagion," he wrote. "Patients describe intrusive thoughts about harming others with household implements, particularly axes and razors." The economic consequences of the terror campaign were equally profound. The Italian-American business community, already marginalized by wartime suspicion and ethnic prejudice, found itself facing complete economic collapse. Grocery stores and small family businesses that had been the backbone of several neighborhoods were abandoned as owners fled the city or barricaded themselves in their homes. Insurance companies began refusing to write policies for businesses owned by Italian immigrants, citing the supernatural risk. posed by the Axeman's apparent targeting of this population. Meanwhile, the music industry in New Orleans experienced an unprecedented boom. Instrument sales skyrocketed as families scrambled to acquire the jazz records and phonographs they believed would protect them. Local musicians found themselves in extraordinary demand, with some earning more in a single night of protection performances than they had previously made in a month. The famous cornet player Buddy Bolden, despite his declining mental health, was reportedly paid enormous sums to play continuously outside the homes of wealthy families who could afford private musical protection. The Axeman's influence on the development of jazz itself cannot be overstated. The music that emerged from New Orleans during and immediately after his reign carried a new intensity, a desperate energy that musicians described as playing for their lives. The improvisation that became jazz's defining characteristic was sharpened by the knowledge that stopping, even for a moment, might invite death. Songs written during this period, such as Axeman's Blues and Devil's Jazz, incorporated lyrical themes of supernatural threat and musical salvation that would influence blues and jazz compositions for decades to come. Religious leaders throughout the city struggled to address their congregation's spiritual crisis. The Catholic Church, dominant among the Italian-American community, found itself unable to provide satisfactory explanations for why God would permit such seemingly supernatural evil to flourish. Father Giuseppe Moretti of St. Mary's Italian Church wrote in his private journal, "My parishioners ask me why their prayers go unanswered while jazz music provides protection. I have no answer that preserves their faith while acknowledging the reality of their experience." Protestant ministers faced similar challenges, with some incorporating jazz music into their services for the first time, arguing that if God worked through the music to protect the innocent, then jazz itself must be sanctified. This theological innovation would have lasting effects on American religious practice, contributing to the eventual acceptance of jazz and other forms of popular music in Christian worship. The investigation itself became increasingly surreal as months passed without progress. Detective Inspector John D'Antonio, who led the police effort, began experiencing what he described as waking nightmares, in which he found himself walking through the crime scenes while they were still occurring, unable to intervene or identify the killer. His official reports from the later stages of the investigation read more like supernatural testimonies than police documents, describing presence manifestations at crime scenes and auditory phenomena that seemed to guide the killer's movements. Federal agents brought in to assist the local investigation fared no better. Agent Thomas Fitzgerald of the Bureau of Investigation wrote to his superiors in Washington that conventional investigative methods appear inadequate to address the phenomena we are observing. This language, carefully crafted to avoid explicit supernatural claims while acknowledging the investigation's failures, reflected the federal government's own bewilderment at the case. The media coverage of the Axeman case pioneered new forms of crime reporting that would influence journalism for generations. Newspapers began employing what they called atmospheric reporting, combining factual crime coverage with detailed descriptions of the city's emotional and psychological state. This sensationalized coverage had the unintended effect of attracting tourists to New Orleans, many of whom came specifically to experience the city's terror firsthand. Hotels reported bookings from individuals who wanted to witness the most haunted city in America during its time of supernatural crisis. Some visitors even requested rooms in neighborhoods where attacks had occurred, hoping to encounter the Axeman themselves. This macabre tourism provided an economic boost that partially offset the losses suffered by Italian-American businesses. The Axeman's final letter, published in newspapers on October 27, 1919, the same day as Mike Pepitone's murder, contained a chilling farewell that seemed to acknowledge his approaching disappearance. "My work in your city approaches completion," the letter read. "I have taught you that safety is an illusion, that music is more powerful than prayer, and that death walks among you wearing the face of ordinary life. You will remember me in every jazz song, in every shadow that falls across your doorway, In every axe that catches the light, I am not leaving you. This final communication proved prophetic. Long after the murders ceased, New Orleans residents continued to report experiences that seemed connected to the Axeman's influence. Musicians described feeling an invisible presence during performances, particularly when playing jazz in the early morning hours. Homeowners reported finding their doors slightly ajar despite having secured them, with no signs of forced entry. Most disturbing were the reports of children born after the Axeman's disappearance, who demonstrated an inexplicable fear of axes and an unusual affinity for jazz music. The case files, officially closed in 1922, were sealed by order of the New Orleans Police Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The stated reason was to protect the privacy of survivors and their families, but internal memos suggest that authorities were more concerned about the psychological impact of the full evidence on public morale. Documents that have been released reveal that investigators had collected far more material than was ever made public, including photographs, witness statements, and physical evidence that painted an even more disturbing picture of the Axeman's capabilities and methods. Dr. Toulouse's final report on the psychological impact of the case, completed in 1923, concluded that the Axeman had succeeded in fundamentally altering the collective unconscious of New Orleans. The killer achieved something unprecedented in criminal history, he wrote. He transformed an entire city's relationship with music, sleep, safety, and death. His victims numbered in the dozens, but his influence touched every resident. But the reign of terror that had gripped New Orleans for over a year left wounds that would never fully heal. The Axeman may have vanished, but his psychological warfare had fundamentally altered the relationship between a city and its music. Jazz, once purely celebratory, now carried the weight of survival. The very art form that had saved lives on that terrifying March night bore permanent scars from its association with death. In the months following the final attack, residents struggled to return to normalcy. Many families abandoned their homes, unable to sleep in rooms where they had once cowered behind locked doors, praying their radios would play loudly enough to appease an unseen demon. The Italian-American community, disproportionately targeted throughout the killing spree, found themselves caught between relief and lingering suspicion. Neighbors who had once welcomed the sound of evening conversations now listened intently for the scrape of tools against wood, the whisper of footsteps in darkened hallways. The police department, exhausted from 18 months of fruitless investigation, quietly reassigned detectives to other cases. Chief of Police Frank Mooney, who had personally overseen the manhunt, retired early in 1920, reportedly telling colleagues that the case had aged him beyond his years. In his final report, never released to the public until decades later, Mooney wrote of his growing conviction that they had been chasing something beyond conventional criminal understanding. The methodical precision, the supernatural timing, the psychological manipulation of an entire population, all suggested a mind operating on principles that defied standard investigative approaches. Local newspapers, which had breathlessly covered every development, gradually shifted their focus to rebuilding and recovery. Yet editors noticed a curious phenomenon in the months that followed. Crime reporting had fundamentally changed. Readers demanded more details about methodology, more analysis of psychological motivation, more exploration of the killer's possible mindset. The Axeman had created a new appetite for understanding criminal behavior that extended far beyond simple reporting of facts. This shift would influence American crime journalism for generations to come. The jazz community itself underwent a profound transformation. Musicians who had played that desperate March night spoke of feeling a strange responsibility, as though their music had been conscripted into service against evil. Some described their instruments as forever changed, imbued with protective power, but also carrying the memory of fear. Club owners reported that audiences listened differently now, with an intensity that bordered on reverence, as though each performance might be their last line of defense against forces beyond comprehension. Dr. Helena Morrison, a psychiatrist who had treated several Axeman survivors, documented what she termed collective traumatic memory. Unlike individual trauma, which affects specific victims, the Axeman had created a shared psychological wound that infected the entire community. Survivors exhibited similar symptoms regardless of whether they had been directly attacked or had simply lived through the terror. Sleep disturbances, hypervigilance to unusual sounds, and an almost compulsive need to keep music playing characterized what Morrison identified as a new form of urban psychological disorder. The supernatural interpretations of the Axeman's identity gained credibility in unexpected quarters. Father Antoine Dubois, a respected Catholic priest who administered to several victim families, publicly stated his belief that the attacks represented a form of spiritual warfare. In his controversial sermon delivered on the first anniversary of the Maggio murders, Father Dubois argued that New Orleans, with its unique blend of cultures and spiritual traditions, had become a battleground between forces of creation, represented by jazz, and forces of destruction, embodied by the Axeman. His words resonated deeply with a population already inclined toward mystical explanations for inexplicable events. The city government, recognizing the need for symbolic closure, commissioned a memorial to the victims in 1921. The monument, located in a small park near the French Quarter, featured an unusual inscription that reflected the case's unique character. Rather than simply listing names and dates, the memorial included musical notation for a brief jazz melody, with the words, "Their music lives on," carved beneath. The dedication ceremony drew thousands of residents who participated in a collective musical performance, playing everything from professional instruments to improvised percussion on pots and pans. Yet even as New Orleans attempted to move forward, disturbing reports emerged from other cities. Police departments in Chicago, St. Louis, and Memphis reported similar attacks featuring the distinctive backdoor panel removal, the use of victims' own tools, and the targeting of sleeping families. None reached the scale or psychological sophistication of the New Orleans crimes, but the pattern was unmistakable. Federal investigators quietly began tracking these incidents, wondering whether the Axeman had relocated or whether his methods had inspired imitators. The most chilling development came in 1923, when a package arrived at the New Orleans Times-Picayune, containing what appeared to be another letter from the Axeman. The handwriting matched previous communications, and the paper bore the same distinctive watermark found on earlier messages. However, the content was different, more reflective than threatening. The letter, published against the advice of police, read in part, "The music has grown stronger since my departure. The city learned to sing with one voice, a harmony born of necessity that transcends my humble contribution to its education." Whether authentic or an elaborate hoax, the letter captured something essential about the Axeman's legacy. His crimes had forced New Orleans to discover collective strength through its most distinctive cultural expression. The terror he inflicted had paradoxically strengthened the very community he had attacked, creating bonds forged in shared vulnerability and mutual protection. As the 1920s progressed and the immediate fear faded, scholars and criminologists began studying the Axeman case as a unique example of psychological terrorism. Unlike killers motivated by personal gratification or material gain, the Axeman had orchestrated his crimes to achieve maximum social disruption while simultaneously offering a path to salvation through cultural participation. This duality, the combination of threat and redemption, created a new category of criminal behavior that would influence the study of serial killing for decades to come. The influence extended beyond academic circles into popular culture. Writers, musicians, and filmmakers drew inspiration from the case's blend of horror and artistry. The image of an entire city playing music to ward off death became a powerful metaphor for the protective power of cultural expression in the face of existential threat. Jazz compositions titled Axeman's Blues and Midnight Music appeared throughout the 1920s, keeping the memory alive while transforming terror into art. Perhaps most significantly, the Axeman case marked a turning point in how American society understood the relationship between individual pathology and collective response. Previous serial killers had been viewed primarily as individual aberrations to be caught and punished. The Axeman demonstrated how a single criminal could reshape an entire community's behavior, forcing thousands of people to alter their daily routines and participate in ritualistic protection. This realization would inform future approaches to mass casualty crimes and terrorist activities. The mystery of the Axeman's identity remained unsolved, but his impact on New Orleans proved permanent. The city that emerged from his reign of terror was fundamentally different from the one he had first stalked. It was more unified, more aware of its cultural strengths, and more resilient in the face of inexplicable threats. The music that had once simply entertained now carried the weight of survival, protection, and community solidarity. In the quiet moments between songs, when the last notes faded into the humid New Orleans night, residents would sometimes pause and listen to the silence. Not the comfortable quiet of safety, but the watchful stillness of a community that had learned to use its voice against the darkness. The Axeman had vanished, but his greatest accomplishment remained. He had taught an entire city that their music was more than entertainment. By November 1919, the city that had danced with death for nearly 2 years was finally beginning to exhale. The last echoes of that terrifying March night, when every household had played jazz to ward off the Axeman's promised visit, still lingered in the collective memory of New Orleans. But what the city didn't realize was that the psychological scars left by those 18 months of terror would prove far more enduring than anyone could have imagined. The transformation was subtle at first, like the way morning fog creeps across the Mississippi. People noticed it in small moments, in the way conversations would suddenly stop when footsteps approached from behind, in how the sound of wood being chopped for kindling could send a chill down someone's spine, in the uncomfortable silence that fell whenever someone mentioned they'd forgotten to lock their back door. New Orleans had been fundamentally altered by its encounter with something that defied explanation, something that had turned the city's greatest joy, its music, into a desperate prayer for survival. Dr. Margaret Rousseau, a physician who had treated several of the Axeman's survivors, began documenting what she observed in the months following the attacks. Her notes, preserved in the archives of Charity Hospital, paint a picture of a community grappling with what we would now recognize as widespread trauma. The patients speak not of nightmares, but of a persistent unease, she wrote in December 1919. They describe feeling watched, followed, as though some presence continues to move through their lives even in daylight hours. This complicated relationship with jazz would become one of the Axeman's most lasting legacies. Musicians found themselves in an impossible position, their art forever linked to that night of citywide terror. Some embraced the connection, writing songs that celebrated their role as unwitting protectors of the city. Others struggled with the knowledge that their music had been conscripted into service by fear itself. The famous jazz pianist Ferdinand "Jelly Roll" Morton later recalled how the Axeman case had changed the very meaning of performance in New Orleans. "We used to play to make people happy, to make them dance and forget their troubles," he said in a 1938 interview. "But after that night in March, every time we played, we remembered we were playing to keep death away." The psychological impact extended beyond individual trauma, into the very fabric of New Orleans society. The tight-knit Italian-American community, which had borne the brunt of the Axeman's attention, found itself forever changed by the experience. Families that had lived in the same neighborhoods for generations began to scatter, some moving to other parts of the city, others leaving New Orleans entirely. Giuseppe Marconi, whose brother had narrowly survived an attack, packed his family and moved to Chicago in early 1920. New Orleans was no longer home, he told relatives years later. This exodus created a ripple effect throughout the city's cultural landscape. The Italian-American community had been integral to New Orleans' commerce, operating many of the small grocery stores and family businesses that served as neighborhood anchors. As these establishments closed or changed hands, entire blocks lost their character, their sense of continuity. The physical architecture of fear began to manifest in more tangible ways as well. Hardware stores reported unprecedented sales of door reinforcements, window bars, and locks throughout 1920 and 1921. The city's building inspectors noted a marked increase in applications for modifications to rear entrances, as homeowners sought to eliminate the vulnerabilities the Axeman had so expertly exploited. But perhaps the most profound change was in the city's relationship with the night itself. New Orleans had always been a nocturnal city, a place where the real life began after sunset, where music spilled from doorways and windows until dawn. The Axeman had poisoned that freedom, introducing a fear that persisted long after his disappearance. Police reports from 1920 show a dramatic increase in calls about suspicious sounds, unfamiliar footsteps, and potential break-ins. Most of these reports proved to be false alarms, but they revealed a city that had lost its ability to feel secure in darkness. The religious community struggled to provide comfort and explanation for what had occurred. Catholic priests found themselves fielding questions they had never encountered before, from parishioners seeking to understand how such evil could exist in a world watched over by a benevolent God. Father Michael O'Brien of St. Mary's Cathedral later wrote about the challenge of ministering to a community that had experienced something beyond traditional categories of sin and suffering. He reflected, "The city's voodoo practitioners, by contrast, found their services in unprecedented demand. Marie Laveau's spiritual descendants reported a surge of visitors seeking protection charms, cleansing rituals, and explanations for what had occurred. In the African American community, where voodoo traditions intermingled with Christian faith, the Axeman was often interpreted through the lens of spiritual warfare, a malevolent entity that had been drawn to New Orleans by the city's unique spiritual energy. This interpretation provided a framework for understanding that many found more satisfying than the police department's admission of complete bafflement. The economic impact of the Axeman's reign of terror extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Tourism, which was already beginning to emerge as a significant part of New Orleans' economy, suffered as word of the mysterious killer spread throughout the nation. Hotel occupancy rates dropped significantly during the summer of 1919, and several planned conventions were relocated to other cities. The damage to the city's reputation was compounded by sensationalized newspaper coverage from around the country, which often portrayed New Orleans as a lawless frontier town where mysterious killers could operate with impunity. Local businesses adapted in various ways to the climate of fear. Many establishments began closing earlier, reluctant to keep employees working late into the night. The famous French Quarter, which had always prided itself on its after-midnight atmosphere, saw a noticeable decline in foot traffic during the peak of the Axeman's activity. Some jazz clubs responded by advertising themselves as safe havens, places where music played continuously and patrons could feel protected by the very art form the Axeman claimed to love. The case also marked a turning point in the relationship between New Orleans and federal law enforcement. The local police department's inability to solve the case or even develop credible leads led to increased federal involvement in local criminal investigations. This represented a significant shift for a city that had always prided itself on handling its own affairs, often in ways that fell outside conventional law enforcement practices. The federal agents who worked on the Axeman case brought new investigative techniques and a more systematic approach, but they also brought an outsider's perspective that sometimes clashed with local customs and methods. Educational institutions found themselves grappling with the psychological impact on children who had lived through the terror. Schools reported increased absenteeism, particularly on days following reports of suspicious activity or false alarms. Teachers noted changes in children's play patterns, with traditional games of hide-and-seek being replaced by more anxious forms of entertainment. Child psychologists, a relatively new profession at the time, began documenting what they observed as the first large-scale study of childhood trauma response to community-wide terror. The literary and artistic community of New Orleans, which had always drawn inspiration from the city's unique atmosphere of beauty and decay, found new material in the Axeman case. Writers began crafting stories that explored themes of urban anonymity, the fragility of civilization, and the ease with which terror could infiltrate domestic spaces. The case provided a real-world foundation for Gothic fiction that had previously relied on European castles and ancient curses. Now, American writers had their own homegrown nightmare to explore, set not in some distant time and place, but in the familiar streets and neighborhoods of a modern American city. Medical professionals found themselves dealing with a range of physical and psychological symptoms they had rarely encountered before. Beyond treating the direct victims of the attacks, doctors reported seeing patients with stress-related ailments, sleep disorders, and what would later be recognized as symptoms of anxiety and depression. The concept of community-wide trauma was not yet well understood, but physicians in New Orleans were witnessing its effects firsthand. Some began keeping detailed records of these cases, inadvertently creating some of the earliest documentation of mass psychological response to terrorism. The legal system also had to adapt to the unique challenges posed by the Axeman case. Prosecutors found themselves dealing with witnesses whose testimony was colored by fear and suggestion, making it difficult to separate reliable observations from panic-induced false memories. Defense attorneys representing the various suspects who were arrested and released discovered that their clients faced a kind of guilt by association that was difficult to counter in court. The case highlighted the limitations of the legal system when confronted with crimes that seemed to transcend normal categories of criminal behavior. Insurance companies began to take notice of the patterns emerging from New Orleans, leading to some of the first discussions about coverage for crimes that might be classified as terrorism rather than ordinary criminal activity. The random nature of the Axeman's attacks, combined with their apparent lack of conventional motive, created new categories of risk that insurance actuaries struggled to quantify. Some companies began excluding coverage for certain types of home invasion crimes, while others raised premiums for properties in neighborhoods where attacks had occurred. As 1920 dawned and the months passed without new attacks, the city began the slow process of healing. But it was a healing that would never be complete. The Axeman had introduced a new kind of fear into American urban life, a fear of the inexplicable, of violence without motive, of evil that could strike anywhere without warning or reason. This fear would prove to be prophetic, anticipating the kinds of random urban violence that would become increasingly common as the 20th century progressed. The case established New Orleans as a place where the impossible could happen, where the boundary between reality and nightmare was perpetually thin. This reputation would become part of the city's identity, attracting some visitors while deterring others, contributing to the unique atmosphere that continues to define New Orleans to this day. The Axeman had given the city a story that was uniquely its own, a tale of terror and survival that no other American city could claim. The musicians who had played through that terrifying March night found themselves part of a legend that would outlive them all. Their music had been transformed from entertainment into a kind of magic, a protective spell that had apparently worked. This transformation would influence how jazz itself was perceived and performed, adding layers of meaning and mysticism that enriched the art form while complicating its relationship to its birthplace. The shadow cast by the Axeman stretched far beyond the 18 months of his active killing. It had touched every aspect of life in New Orleans, from the most intimate family relationships to the broadest economic and cultural patterns. The city had learned that it was possible to live under siege not from an army or a natural disaster, but from a single individual whose motives remained completely opaque. This lesson would resonate through subsequent decades, informing how New Orleans and other American cities would respond to future threats, both real and imagined. In the end, the Axeman's greatest victory may have been not the lives he took, but the innocence he destroyed. New Orleans in 1917 had been a city that believed in its own invulnerability, protected by its unique culture, its spiritual traditions, and its distance from the troubles that plagued other parts of the world. The Axeman shattered that belief forever, leaving behind a city that was wiser but wounded, more cautious but less trusting, forever changed by its encounter with inexplicable evil. The investigation revealed something that would forever alter how New Orleans understood evil itself. As authorities desperately searched for the Axeman through the spring and summer of 1919, they uncovered evidence suggesting this wasn't merely a man with an axe. This was something that understood the very soul of New Orleans, something that knew exactly how to weaponize the city's deepest spiritual beliefs and cultural foundations. The letters that arrived at newspaper offices weren't just threats. They were psychological warfare crafted by someone who possessed an intimate knowledge of New Orleans culture that seemed impossible for any ordinary killer. The correspondence referenced specific Creole spiritual practices, quoted obscure passages from local voodoo traditions, and demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the city's complex relationship between Catholicism and folk magic. Most disturbing was how the letters seemed to predict not just when attacks would occur, but how the city would respond emotionally to each escalation. Detective Ray LaManna, who led the investigation, noted in his private journals that the killer appeared to possess knowledge that went beyond what any outsider could have learned. The Axeman knew which families kept axes in specific locations within their homes. He understood the architectural patterns of Creole cottages well enough to remove door panels without making sound. He seemed to anticipate police patrol routes and neighborhood watch schedules with uncanny precision. But what truly unnerved investigators was the killer's apparent ability to read the psychological pulse of New Orleans itself. Each letter arrived precisely when fear was beginning to subside, reigniting terror with surgical timing. The famous jazz ultimatum came not randomly, but at the exact moment when the city's collective anxiety had reached a breaking point where people were desperate enough to believe that music could save them. The response to that ultimatum revealed something extraordinary about human nature under extreme duress. On the night of March 19th, New Orleans didn't just play jazz. The city transformed into something unprecedented in American history. Every neighborhood became a stage, every home a concert hall. The music wasn't celebration. It was survival. Families who had never owned instruments borrowed them from neighbors. Children who couldn't play anything banged pots and pans in rhythm. The elderly hummed melodies from their youth while trembling behind locked doors. What emerged that night was a sound unlike anything ever heard before or since. It wasn't the polished jazz of the famous clubs or the practiced performances of professional musicians. It was the raw, desperate music of a city playing for its life. The cacophony of fear mixed with melody, terror harmonized with hope, created an atmosphere so surreal that many who lived through it described the experience as otherworldly. The most chilling aspect was that it worked. No attacks occurred that night. Whether through coincidence or something more mysterious, the Axeman honored his twisted bargain. This success only deepened the psychological hold he had over the city. If music could prevent murder, then silence became synonymous with death. The very absence of sound took on supernatural significance. In the weeks following the jazz night, New Orleans developed what psychologists would later recognize as a form of collective trauma. The city couldn't tolerate silence. Restaurants kept musicians playing continuously. Shops left radios on throughout business hours. Families slept with phonographs running beside their beds. The normal rhythm of urban life, with its natural periods of quiet, became impossible to maintain. Children began having nightmares about silence itself. They would wake screaming not from bad dreams, but from the absence of sound in their rooms. Parents reported that their children refused to sleep unless music was playing, and some developed severe anxiety when musical performances ended. Schools had to adjust their schedules because students couldn't concentrate during quiet study periods. The religious community struggled to understand what was happening to their city. Catholic priests found themselves conducting masses accompanied by jazz musicians, afraid that traditional silence during prayer might invite evil. Protestant ministers debated whether the Axeman represented a test of faith or a manifestation of supernatural evil that required non-traditional responses. Some churches began holding continuous prayer services with musical accompaniment, blending Christian worship with the protective power of jazz. The city's voodoo practitioners, already influential in New Orleans' spiritual life, saw their importance increase dramatically. People who had never previously consulted spiritual advisors began seeking protection rituals. Marie Laveau's followers claimed the Axeman was a spiritual entity that could only be controlled through specific musical offerings. They prescribed particular songs, rhythms, and instruments for different levels of protection. This spiritual crisis extended beyond individual fear into questions about the nature of evil itself. The Axeman didn't fit traditional categories of criminal behavior. He wasn't motivated by greed, passion, or revenge. His demands seemed designed not for personal gain, but to demonstrate power over the collective psyche of an entire population. He had turned music from a source of joy into a desperate necessity, transformed cultural expression into survival behavior. The letters continued to arrive sporadically through the summer of 1919, each one demonstrating deeper psychological insight into the city's condition. The killer seemed to understand that New Orleans was fracturing under the pressure of constant vigilance. He knew that families were fighting over whether to keep music playing all night. He recognized that the economy was suffering as people spent money on instruments and phonograph records instead of necessities. One particularly disturbing letter, published in the Times-Picayune in August 1919, showed how completely the Axeman understood what he had created. He wrote about walking through neighborhoods and hearing the desperate music emanating from every home, describing it as a symphony of fear that pleased him more than any traditional concert. He claimed to enjoy knowing that children were learning to associate silence with death, that lovers whispered endearments over the sound of mandolins, that old people hummed themselves to sleep with trembling voices. The investigation itself became a form of psychological torture for law enforcement. Every lead seemed to dissolve upon examination. Witnesses provided descriptions that contradicted each other so completely they seemed to be describing different people entirely. Physical evidence vanished or proved meaningless. The killer's methods were so precise that they left investigators feeling professionally inadequate, as if they were trying to catch a ghost with conventional police work. Detective Lamanna began experiencing what he called waking nightmares, where he would hear jazz music in his head continuously. Other officers reported similar symptoms. The investigation team found themselves unable to work in complete quiet, requiring background music in their offices and meeting rooms. The Axeman had infected even those hunting him with his peculiar form of madness. As autumn approached in 1919, the city waited for what many believed would be the Axeman's final performance. The pattern of his attacks suggested escalation, and people feared he was building towards something unprecedented. The October attack on Mike Pepitone seemed to confirm these fears. The brutality was more extreme than previous murders, and Mrs. Pepitone's description of the killer suggested someone who had moved beyond mere homicide into ritualistic violence. But then came the silence that was more terrifying than any music. After October 1919, the Axeman simply vanished. No farewell letter, no final ultimatum, no explanation. The absence of his presence became another form of psychological warfare. How could a city that had been conditioned to expect terror learn to trust quiet again? How could people who had been taught that silence meant death return to normal patterns of rest and contemplation? The silence after the Axeman was not peace. It was the sound of a city holding its breath, waiting for a symphony of terror that never came. The music stopped, but the fear never did. By the winter of 1919, New Orleans had begun to exhale for the first time in over a year. The Axeman's reign of terror seemed to have ended as abruptly as it began, but what he left behind was something far more insidious than blood and broken door panels. He had fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of an entire city, creating a legacy of paranoia that would endure long after his final victim had been laid to rest. The immediate aftermath revealed the true scope of the Axeman's psychological warfare. Police reports from late 1919 and early 1920 documented a dramatic increase in what today we would recognize as symptoms of collective trauma. Citizens reported chronic insomnia, with many unable to sleep without music playing continuously through the night. Hardware stores couldn't keep door reinforcements and locks in stock. The sound of footsteps on wooden floors sent entire households into panic. Most telling was the phenomenon investigators called the silence syndrome, where any unexpected quiet during nighttime hours would trigger mass anxiety throughout neighborhoods. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a physician at Charity Hospital, documented the medical impact in his private journals. "We are treating an epidemic of nervous exhaustion unlike anything in my 30 years of practice," he wrote in December 1919. Patients present with symptoms ranging from severe insomnia to what appears to be a form of musical obsession. Many cannot function without constant auditory stimulation. The economic consequences were equally profound. The city's Italian-American grocers, who had been disproportionately targeted by the Axeman, found their businesses devastated not only by the murders, but by the lingering fear among customers. Many families simply refused to shop in stores owned by people who shared the victim's ethnicity, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that fractured community bonds. Several prominent Italian-American families left New Orleans entirely, selling their businesses at significant losses rather than remain in a city where they felt marked for death. Perhaps most remarkably, the Axeman had succeeded in weaponizing music itself. Jazz, once the pure expression of New Orleans' cultural soul, now carried the weight of survival. Musicians reported feeling an enormous pressure when performing, knowing that their music had literally saved lives on that terrifying March night. Some described experiencing what they called phantom audiences, the sensation that someone unseen was listening intently to every note, judging whether their performance was adequate protection against an invisible threat. The psychological manipulation extended beyond fear into the realm of control. By making his continued absence contingent on the city's musical behavior, the Axeman had created a form of behavioral conditioning on a massive scale. Even months after the last attack, many residents continued the ritual of playing jazz through the night, unable to break the association between music and safety. This wasn't superstition, investigators realized, but a rational response to trauma. The Axeman had proven that he could control an entire population's behavior through carefully orchestrated terror. Religious leaders struggled to provide comfort in the face of such unprecedented evil. Father Michael Donovan of St. Louis Cathedral wrote in his parish newsletter, "We face not merely a criminal, but something that challenges our understanding of human nature itself. How do we counsel parishioners who have witnessed evil so methodical, so theatrical, that it seems to transcend ordinary malice?" The investigation's failure added another layer to the city's collective wound. Detective Raymond Cassard, who had led much of the police effort, suffered what his colleagues described as a complete breakdown in early 1920. "We had every resource, every technique available to us," he reportedly told his family before requesting reassignment to another city. "Yet we were chasing shadows, pursuing a phantom who seemed to understand our methods better than we understood his." The media's role in amplifying the Axeman's psychological impact became a subject of intense debate. Newspaper editors found themselves in an impossible position, needing to inform the public while avoiding sensationalism that might serve the killer's apparent desire for theatrical recognition. The Times-Picayune's editor, James Morrison, later admitted in his memoirs that covering the Axeman case had fundamentally changed his understanding of journalism's responsibilities. "We realized too late that by publishing his letter, by giving him the platform he craved, we had become unwilling participants in his performance." The letter itself became an object of obsessive analysis. Handwriting experts, theologians, and early criminal psychologists studied every word, seeking clues not just to his identity, but to his motivations. The Axeman's sophisticated understanding of the city's cultural dynamics suggested someone with deep local knowledge, yet his ability to evade detection implied skills that seemed almost supernatural to contemporary investigators. His references to hell and damnation, combined with his obvious intelligence and cultural awareness, created a profile that defied conventional categorization. Most disturbing was the realization that the Axeman had achieved a form of immortality through terror. Unlike other killers who sought fame or notoriety, He had embedded himself into the city's collective consciousness so deeply that his presence was felt even in his absence. Children born after his disappearance would grow up hearing stories of the night when Jazz saved New Orleans, ensuring that his legend would perpetuate across generations. The cultural impact rippled outward beyond New Orleans. Jazz musicians traveling from the city carried with them not just musical innovations but stories of the Axeman, spreading his legend throughout the American South and beyond. The idea of music as protection, of art as a literal shield against evil, became woven into the broader mythology of jazz itself. Some historians argue that the Axeman's influence can be traced in the development of jazz as America's first truly indigenous art form, forever linking creativity with survival in the American cultural imagination. By 1920, New Orleans had begun developing what psychologists would later recognize as adaptive mechanisms for processing collective trauma. Community gatherings increasingly featured musical elements, as if the city had unconsciously learned that shared musical experiences provided a sense of safety and solidarity. Church services incorporated more musical elements, and even business meetings often began with brief musical interludes. The Axeman had inadvertently created a more musical city, though one where the joy of music was forever tinged with the memory of terror. The silence he left behind was perhaps his most masterful stroke. Without resolution, without capture, without even confirmation of his death, the Axeman had ensured that his story would never truly end. Every unexplained sound in the night, every moment of unexpected quiet, every jazz melody played in the darkness carried the possibility of his return. He had achieved what few killers ever manage, transforming himself from a person into a permanent condition of fear that would define New Orleans for generations to come. The Axeman's true genius lay not in his ability to kill, but in his understanding that the greatest terror comes not from death itself, but from the knowledge that death can arrive without warning, without reason, without the possibility of prevention through any rational means. He had stripped away the illusions of safety that allow civilized society to function, replacing them with the stark knowledge that evil can wear any face, enter any home, and strike without leaving so much as a footprint in its wake. In creating this atmosphere of perpetual uncertainty, the Axeman had accomplished something unprecedented in American criminal history. He had made an entire city complicit in its own terrorization, turning every citizen into both potential victim and unwilling participant in his deadly performance. By November 1919, the letters had stopped arriving at newspaper offices. The last known correspondence from the figure who claimed to be the Axeman had been received weeks before Mike Pepitoni's murder, and as autumn deepened into winter, New Orleans began to exhale a collective breath it had been holding for nearly 2 years. Yet this silence carried its own weight, heavy with questions that would haunt the city long after the terror had seemingly ended. The psychological aftermath of the Axeman's reign revealed itself in ways both subtle and profound. Jazz musicians found themselves in an impossible position, their art forever entangled with survival and fear. What had once been pure expression now carried the memory of that terrifying night when an entire city played music to stay alive. Some musicians embraced this dark legacy, incorporating the story into their performances, while others struggled with the knowledge that their beloved jazz had been weaponized by a killer who understood its cultural power. The medical examiner's office continued to receive inquiries about the case long after the last attack. Dr. Charles Dowling, who had examined several of the victims, noted in his private correspondence that the precision of the attacks suggested someone with anatomical knowledge. The killer had struck with surgical accuracy, avoiding major arteries when he intended victims to survive, severing them cleanly when death was the goal. This wasn't the work of a frenzied madman, but of someone who understood exactly how to calibrate violence to achieve specific outcomes. Religious communities throughout New Orleans grappled with the theological implications of the Axeman's letters. Father Antonio Sedella of St. Louis Cathedral received dozens of confessions from parishioners who feared they had somehow invited evil into their lives. The killer's claims of being a spirit from hell, combined with his apparent supernatural abilities to enter homes undetected, challenged conventional understanding of evil as purely human phenomenon. Prayer vigils became common, with congregants seeking protection not just from earthly dangers but from forces beyond mortal comprehension. The city's relationship with its own darkness fundamentally shifted during this period. New Orleans had always embraced its reputation as a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where voodoo practitioners worked alongside Catholic priests, where the dead were celebrated as much as mourned. But the Axeman had perverted this mystical atmosphere, turning the city's openness to supernatural forces into a vulnerability that could be exploited by malevolent entities. Detective John D'Antonio, who had led much of the investigation, found himself unable to let go of the case even after official resources were redirected elsewhere. His personal notes, discovered decades later in his family's attic, revealed a man consumed by the mystery. He had developed an elaborate theory connecting the Axeman to ancient ritualistic practices, suggesting that the killer was following some form of ceremonial pattern that investigators had failed to recognize. D'Antonio believed the jazz demand wasn't random, but part of a larger spiritual working that required the city's collective participation. The Italian-American community, which had borne the brunt of the attacks, began to organize in ways that would have lasting effects on New Orleans society. Mutual aid societies that had formed during the terror continued operating long after the danger passed, creating networks of support that strengthened the community's political and economic influence. Some families left the city entirely, but those who remained found their bonds deepened by shared trauma and survival. Local newspapers, having profited from the sensational coverage of the murders, struggled with the ethical implications of their role in amplifying the killer's message. The Times-Picayune's editor, James Ewing, wrote privately about the moral complexity of publishing the Axeman's letters, recognizing that while the public had a right to know, the coverage also gave the killer exactly the platform he had sought. This tension between public safety and media responsibility would influence how future crimes were reported in the city. The economic impact of the Axeman's reign extended far beyond the immediate costs of increased police presence and security measures. Tourism, already recovering from the disruptions of World War I, suffered another blow as the city's reputation for safety deteriorated. Hotels reported cancellations, and the famous French Quarter saw a noticeable decline in visitors during the height of the terror. Local businesses, particularly those owned by Italian Americans, faced boycotts from customers who feared association with the killer's preferred targets. Children who lived through the Axeman period carried the trauma into adulthood in ways that shaped an entire generation. School attendance dropped significantly during the most intense months of 1919, as parents feared leaving their homes or allowing their children to travel alone. Teachers reported increased anxiety, nightmares, and behavioral problems among students. Some children developed elaborate rituals around music and sleep, requiring jazz to be played before bedtime well into their adult years. The investigation itself had pushed the boundaries of early forensic science, with detectives attempting techniques that were revolutionary for their time. Fingerprint analysis, still in its infancy, was applied to the crime scenes with limited success. The Axeman's apparent use of gloves or other protective measures meant that traditional evidence gathering proved frustratingly ineffective. This case became a catalyst for improvements in criminal investigation techniques throughout Louisiana and beyond. As 1919 drew to a close, New Orleans found itself forever changed by the experience of collective terror. The city had learned that evil could be both intimate and anonymous, both supernatural and brutally physical. The Axeman had demonstrated that a single individual, working alone and unknown, could hold an entire metropolitan area hostage through carefully calculated violence and psychological manipulation. The music that had once saved the city continued to play, but it carried new meanings now. Every jazz performance was a small act of defiance against the darkness that had briefly conquered New Orleans. Every note played was a reminder that the city had faced the unthinkable and survived, that art and community could triumph over terror and isolation. Yet beneath this celebration lay a permanent awareness that such evil could return, that the very culture that defined New Orleans could again be turned against itself by someone who understood its power. The Axeman's final gift to New Orleans was this paradox. He had shown the city both its greatest vulnerability and its most powerful defense. By late 1919, as the October winds swept through New Orleans carrying the last echoes of the Axeman's reign, the city found itself trapped in a peculiar psychological purgatory. The killer had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared, but his absence felt less like relief and more like the held breath before a scream that never comes. The jazz that had once saved lives now carried an undertone of dread, each note a reminder of nights when music meant survival. The investigation, led by Detective Joseph D'Antonio, had reached a maddening dead end. Despite following every lead, interrogating hundreds of suspects, and analyzing every piece of evidence, the Axeman remained as elusive as smoke. What frustrated investigators most was not the lack of clues, but the surplus of them, each pointing in different directions like a compass gone mad. The killer had left behind a trail of contradictions that seemed almost deliberately designed to confuse. The final known letter arrived at the Times-Picayune offices on November 15, 1919, nearly 3 weeks after Mike Pepitone's murder. Unlike the theatrical proclamations of the past, this message was brief, almost casual in its terror. The symphony concludes, but the musician never truly leaves the stage. Listen carefully to the silence between the notes. The handwriting matched previous correspondence, but the tone suggested something different, a finality that chilled investigators more than his previous threats. What made this disappearance particularly haunting was how it coincided with broader changes sweeping through New Orleans. The city was evolving, modernizing, leaving behind some of its old-world mysticism for the promise of a new decade. Electric lights were replacing gas lamps in many neighborhoods. Automobiles were becoming more common, and the old Creole cottages were giving way to newer construction. It was as if the Axeman belonged to an older, darker version of the city that was slowly being erased. Yet the psychological impact of his reign proved impossible to erase. Dr. Margaret Rousseau, one of the first female psychiatrists in Louisiana, documented what she termed collective nocturnal anxiety among New Orleans residents. Her case studies, published years later, revealed that even months after the attacks ceased, people continued to sleep with music playing, axes hidden or removed from their homes, and back doors reinforced with additional locks. Children born during the Axeman's active period showed unusual responses to silence, becoming agitated when music stopped playing at night. The jazz community itself was forever changed by their unlikely role as the city's protectors. Musicians who had played during those terror-filled nights found themselves both celebrated and haunted by their experience. Leon Rapolo, a young clarinetist who had performed on the famous March 19th night, later wrote, "We thought we were just playing music, but we were really playing for souls. Every note felt like a prayer, every song like a spell." Some musicians reported strange experiences during performances in the months following the Axeman's disappearance. Sidney Bechet, the renowned saxophonist, claimed to have felt an unseen presence during late-night sessions, as if someone was listening from the shadows with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Other performers spoke of hearing additional instruments that weren't there, phantom melodies that seemed to weave themselves into their music. The Axeman's influence on New Orleans culture extended beyond music into the realm of folklore and superstition. Local spiritual practitioners, including both voodoo practitioners and Catholic mystics, developed new rituals and protections based on the killer's apparent weaknesses. Maria Laveau's niece, Marie Laveau, created what she called jazz gris-gris, protective charms that incorporated musical elements. These talismans became popular throughout the city, worn by people who couldn't quite let go of the fear that their mysterious tormentor might return. Detective D'Antonio, who had become obsessed with the case, continued investigating long after official resources were redirected elsewhere. His personal journals, discovered decades later, revealed a man slowly consumed by the mystery he couldn't solve. "The Axeman didn't just kill bodies," he wrote in one entry. "He killed certainty. He killed the belief that evil has a face, a name, a motive we can understand." D'Antonio's investigation uncovered disturbing patterns that suggested the Axeman's knowledge of New Orleans went far deeper than anyone had initially realized. The killer had demonstrated intimate familiarity with the city's architecture, knowing exactly which homes had the vulnerable door panels that characterized older Creole construction. He had timed his attacks to coincide with specific lunar phases and had shown awareness of his victims' routines that suggested extensive surveillance. More unsettling was evidence that the Axeman had been present in New Orleans long before his first known attack. D'Antonio discovered reports of similar incidents dating back to 1911, attacks that had been dismissed as isolated crimes or domestic disputes. The pattern was there for those who knew how to look, a slow crescendo of violence that had built toward the explosive terror of 1918 and 1919. The detective's investigation also revealed the Axeman's sophisticated understanding of police procedures and newspaper operations. The timing of his letters, the language he used, and his apparent ability to evade capture despite the massive manhunt all suggested someone with insider knowledge of law enforcement tactics. This led to the disturbing possibility that the killer had connections within the very institutions trying to catch him. As 1919 drew to a close, New Orleans found itself grappling with a new kind of ghost story. Unlike the traditional spirits that populated the city's cemeteries and ancient buildings, the Axeman represented something more modern and more terrifying, a phantom who used the tools of contemporary life to spread his terror. He had weaponized music, corrupted the sanctity of sleep, and turned the very architecture of the city against its inhabitants. The economic impact of the Axeman's reign was substantial but often overlooked. Many Italian-American businesses, already struggling with post-war economic challenges and ethnic prejudice, found themselves further marginalized by their association with the killer's victims. Some families left New Orleans entirely, unable to rebuild their lives in a city where their very presence seemed to invite danger. The religious community struggled to provide comfort to a population traumatized by seemingly supernatural events. Father Giuseppe Martinelli, who administered to many of the victims' families, found his faith tested by parishioners who asked how God could permit such inexplicable evil. "They want to know why their prayers weren't answered," he wrote to his bishop. But perhaps their prayers were answered. Protestant ministers and Jewish rabbis faced similar challenges, trying to reconcile their theological understanding with events that seemed to defy rational explanation. Some embraced the mystery, suggesting that the Axeman represented a test of faith or a reminder of the supernatural forces that still operated in the world. Others attempted to provide purely secular explanations, focusing on the psychological and social factors that might have created such a killer. The medical community, meanwhile, was fascinated by the Axeman's apparent surgical precision. Dr. Henri Dupuy, who had examined several of the victims, noted that the killer's strikes were delivered with anatomical knowledge that suggested medical training. The wounds were inflicted with an understanding of exactly where to strike for maximum damage, he reported. This medical expertise, combined with the killer's knowledge of police procedures and his sophisticated psychological manipulation of the entire city, painted a picture of someone with extensive education and training. Yet no missing person reports matched this profile. No medical students or discharged military surgeons had disappeared during the relevant period. The Axeman seemed to exist in the spaces between categories, defying every attempt to classify or understand him. As winter settled over New Orleans in late 1919, the city began to develop new rhythms of life that accommodated the lingering fear of the Axeman's possible return. Music became more than entertainment. It became a form of insurance, a nightly ritual that many residents couldn't abandon even as the months passed without incident. Jazz clubs found themselves packed not just with revelers, but with people seeking the safety that music had once provided. The Axeman's legacy was already being woven into the cultural fabric of New Orleans. joining the pantheon of local legends and mysteries that gave the city its unique character. Children who had lived through the terror would grow up to tell their own children about the nights when jazz saved lives, when an entire city played music to keep death at bay. The story would evolve with each telling, becoming more myth than memory, but never losing its power to chill and fascinate. Yet even as the Axeman story began its transformation into legend, those who had lived through his reign remained convinced that the silence was temporary, that somewhere in the shadows between the notes, he was still listening, still watching, still waiting for the music to stop. The threads of the Axeman's influence stretched far beyond those final murders in October 1919, weaving themselves into the very fabric of New Orleans' cultural DNA. The city that had once played jazz to survive now found itself forever changed by that terrifying year, carrying forward a legacy that would shape how it understood itself for generations to come. In the immediate aftermath of the killings, as 1920 dawned without fresh bloodshed, New Orleans experienced what historians would later term a cultural renaissance born from collective trauma. The jazz clubs that had stayed open through those fearful nights became gathering places for a community processing its shared nightmare. Musicians who had played desperately through the darkness now performed with a new intensity, their music carrying undertones of survival and defiance that audiences could feel in their bones. The psychological impact on individual families proved profound and lasting. Children who had lived through the Axeman's reign grew up with a fundamentally different relationship to safety and sleep. Many developed rituals around nighttime that persisted well into adulthood, checking locks multiple times, leaving radios playing softly, positioning furniture to block back entrances. These behaviors became so common that they formed their own cultural patterns, passed down through families like inherited trauma wrapped in practical wisdom. The Italian-American community, which had borne the brunt of the Axeman's fury, underwent a transformation that would influence New Orleans' demographics for decades. Many families relocated to other neighborhoods or left the city entirely, fundamentally altering the ethnic composition of entire districts. Those who remained often became more insular, creating tighter community bonds while simultaneously developing an almost supernatural vigilance about their surroundings. Local law enforcement, humbled by their complete failure to identify or capture the killer, implemented changes that would modernize policing in New Orleans for the 20th century. New communication systems between precincts, improved evidence collection protocols, and the city's first formal cooperation with federal investigators all emerged from the ashes of the Axeman case. The department's inability to solve the murders had exposed weaknesses that officials were determined never to repeat. The religious community grappled with theological questions that the Axeman's letters had raised. How could a being claim companionship with the devil while demanding jazz, a form of music many considered sacred? Catholic churches found themselves fielding questions about evil's true nature, while practitioners of local spiritual traditions saw the case as confirmation of forces beyond conventional understanding. Some congregations began incorporating jazz elements into their worship, viewing the music as having been blessed through its role in protecting the city. Musicians themselves experienced a complex transformation in how they understood their craft. The knowledge that their art had literally saved lives imbued jazz with a power that went beyond entertainment or artistic expression. Many performers reported feeling a weight of responsibility when they played, as if their music carried protective qualities that demanded respect and dedication. This elevated sense of purpose contributed to New Orleans jazz evolving in directions that emphasized both technical excellence and spiritual depth. The tourism industry, barely established in 1919, began incorporating the Axeman legend into its promotional materials almost immediately. Tour guides started including sites connected to the murders in their roots, and entrepreneurs developed walking tours focused specifically on the case. This commercialization of the terror created tension within communities still healing from the trauma, but it also ensured that the story would be preserved and retold to countless visitors from around the world. Academic interest in the case grew steadily through the 1920s and beyond. Criminologists studied it as an early example of serial killing with psychological rather than material motives. Sociologists examined how an entire city had responded to sustained terror through collective action. Music historians analyzed the relationship between fear and artistic expression, noting how the Axeman had inadvertently created one of the largest coordinated musical performances in American history. The legend's influence on popular culture proved remarkably enduring. Authors drew inspiration from the case for horror novels that explored themes of music as protection against evil. Playwrights created theatrical works that used the Axeman story to examine social fears about immigration, urbanization, and the changing nature of American communities. Even Hollywood eventually discovered the case, though early film adaptations struggled to capture the subtle psychological horror that had made the original events so terrifying. Perhaps most significantly, the Axeman case established New Orleans as America's premier city of supernatural mystery. The combination of his unexplained abilities, his supernatural claims, and his complete disappearance created a template for how the city understood and marketed its relationship with the otherworldly. Ghost tours, paranormal investigations, and supernatural-themed businesses all trace their lineage back to the cultural shift that occurred during those fearful months in 1918 and 1919. The investigation itself became a case study in the limitations of early 20th century police work. Detective techniques that might have solved the case simply didn't exist yet. Fingerprinting was in its infancy, psychological profiling was decades away, and forensic science consisted of basic observation and measurement. Modern investigators who have reviewed the case files often express frustration at evidence that was overlooked or improperly preserved, clues that might have led to identification if proper techniques had been available. Conspiracy theories about the Axeman's identity multiplied over the decades, fed by the complete absence of resolution. Some researchers became convinced that the killer had been protected by corrupt officials or powerful organized crime figures. Others believed the murders were connected to larger patterns of violence against Italian Americans that authorities preferred to ignore. A few investigators dedicated their entire careers to pursuing leads that had gone cold decades earlier, driven by the conviction that somewhere in the archived materials lay the key to solving the case. The impact on New Orleans architecture proved surprisingly lasting. The Axeman's method of entry through removed back panels led to widespread modifications in home construction and security. Hardware stores reported unprecedented sales of reinforced door panels, additional locks, and window bars. These modifications became so common that they influenced the city's building codes, creating architectural features that remained standard for decades and contributed to New Orleans' distinctive residential appearance. Medical professionals who had treated the Axeman's victims carried their experiences forward into advancing trauma care. The psychological wounds inflicted by the attacks were unlike anything doctors had previously encountered, leading to new approaches in treating victims of violent crime. These innovations in care eventually influenced how the city responded to other traumatic events, creating a foundation for more sophisticated victim support services. The case also highlighted the power of mass media to shape public response to crisis. Newspaper coverage of the murders and the Axeman's letters demonstrated how information could be used to either calm or inflame public fears. Editors learned to balance the public's right to know with the potential for creating panic, lessons that proved valuable during future emergencies and disasters that would strike New Orleans in later decades. Educational institutions began incorporating the Axeman case into their curricula as an example of how communities respond to sustained threat. Psychology courses examined the mass behavior changes that occurred when an entire city modified its nighttime routines. History classes used the case to discuss immigration tensions and urban development in the early 20th century. Criminal justice programs studied it as an example of how unsolved cases can shape law enforcement practices for generations. The spiritual and supernatural aspects of the case continued to influence New Orleans' religious and cultural practices long after the murders ended. Some families maintained traditions of playing music during times of particular vulnerability or fear, believing that the protection the city had experienced during the Axeman's reign could be invoked again if needed. These practices blended with existing spiritual traditions to create unique forms of cultural expression that remain distinctly New Orleans. As decades passed and the original witnesses died, the Axeman evolved from historical figure to mythological presence. Children who had never lived through the terror learned his story as part of their cultural inheritance. The specific details of individual murders became less important than the larger narrative of a city that had faced inexplicable evil and survived through collective action and the power of music. Modern true crime enthusiasts have embraced the Axeman case as one of America's most compelling unsolved mysteries. Internet forums dedicated to the case attract researchers from around the world who continue searching for connections and clues that earlier investigators might have missed. DNA technology has raised hopes that physical evidence preserved from the crime scenes might eventually yield answers, though the degradation of materials stored under less than ideal conditions for over a century makes successful analysis unlikely. The case established New Orleans as a destination for those interested in authentic American mystery and supernatural lore. Unlike manufactured tourist attractions, the Axeman story emerged organically from real events that had genuinely terrified a major American city. This authenticity gave New Orleans a unique position in the landscape of American dark tourism, attracting visitors seeking connection with genuine historical mystery rather than fabricated entertainment. Today, more than a century after the Axeman vanished into the night, his influence permeates New Orleans in ways both obvious and subtle. Street musicians playing on corners carry forward the tradition of music as protection and community building. Jazz clubs operate with an awareness of their role in the city's survival story. Residents still tell the tale to newcomers as both history lesson and initiation into the city's unique culture. The Axeman of New Orleans achieved a form of immortality that he likely never intended. By demanding that a city play music to survive, he created a legend that transformed terror into cultural strength. His story became proof that even in humanity's darkest moments, art and community can provide salvation. The music that New Orleans played in fear became the foundation for joy, celebration, and resilience that defines the city to this day. In the end, perhaps the Axeman's greatest mystery isn't who he was or where he went, but how a story of such darkness became a source of light for a city that refused to let fear silence its music. The jazz still plays in New Orleans every night, as it has since 1919, carrying within its rhythms the memory of a time when music meant the difference between life and death, and a community discovered that together, they could survive anything.